Welcome back to Exploring AWS. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about actually accessing your EC2 instances. I know I've shown you how to create them. We've talked about what they're for. We've talked about a couple of the different services, but all of that is useless if you don't actually know how to get to your instances and how to run commands, how to install updates, and how to install your code and all that fun stuff. If you can't get to the console, then essentially setting up a server is kind of pointless. Now, there's a couple different ways that you can get to your instances. The easiest way, let me actually click on this instance here, this dummy instance that we have set up. Whoops. And you'll notice that I do actually have a public address set up, and I also have public DNS set up on this server. Generally speaking, the easiest way for you to connect into your EC2 instances or any of your servers that you have set up is going to be that they're available out on the internet with a public address. But understandably, that's not ideal, right? So essentially what I have now is I have an EC2 instance that's sitting here that allows inbound internet access. So here's INET, and anybody essentially from the internet, in theory, could get to my EC2 instance. Now, in this case, it's a lab. I don't really care. It is definitely the easiest way, but it's probably the most unsecure way because anybody can really hit that address and start trying to ping it or get to it, right? There's a number of different ways that we can secure it with security groups and only allow traffic from your address, but that I think is a little bit more in depth than what they're going to ask on your exam. So what I can do is I can set up my EC2 instance, be publicly addressable from the outside world, and I can essentially connect into it. Now, there's a couple of different ways that we can connect into those external EC2 instances, and we'll get to those in a minute. There's essentially SSH, Sessions Manager, and I think it's Instance Manager. But again, you don't want every single EC2 instance to be publicly addressable. You don't want every instance out there on the internet. So generally what people do is they set up what's called a jump host. So let's imagine that this EC2 instance here is a jump host that does have a public IP that does allow us to SSH in, and then from there, once they connect into that public EC2 instance, then they move laterally into their internal subnets, their internal VPC, if you will, and they then start accessing these internal instances. So this guy here is the only one that's addressable from the outside world. And you can use RDP. If you want to use Windows, you can use SSH. I even think that if you go into setting up your EC2 instances, there's even an AMI for, I think, Guacamole. So there's a lot of different ways that you can set this up. But essentially, this is the general architecture of being able to get into your instances within AWS. And again, there's a couple of different ways that you can get to this instance here. And you don't always need a public address. There are ways around that, but ideally, this is kind of the architecture that I go with the most often. Now let's talk about the ways that you can actually get into these instances. So I'm going to keep this instance checked, and I'm going to go over to connect. Now, the first way that I have is called Instance Connect. Now, you can see that it's connecting to that 18.207.110.1 address. Here's the username that I'm going to connect with. I'll just go ahead and say connect. Now, in theory, what this is going to do is this is going to drop me right into the console, and you can see it does respond. I can escalate my privilege if I know how to spell. I could do, let's just do an update. So yum update /y. There's probably nothing to update, but regardless, you can see that the console does actually respond. It connects me right into that public instance, but to me, I'm actually not connecting into the public instance because I'm actually doing it through the portal. So it does give me a little bit of security because obviously I have to log into the portal first, through multi-factor authentication, my username and password, all that kind of stuff before I get to this point. So it is secure. You're not connecting directly to it. And there's also nothing that you have to use to set up here. So with the Instance Connect, there's no fancy services or anything like that. You just basically say, I want to connect, and you're good. This does not work with every server and service. So SSH, this is where you can, again, connect directly to your instance. I do want you to pay very close attention to the private key file. So when you're setting up your EC2 instances, you know that there was a private key that we set up. If you did not download that, you may have to go and create a new one. And that's a little bit of a pain to do after the fact that you've created the instance. So when you create it, make sure that you have that private key file. And then essentially, if you have the right security groups and you're allowing SSH access in, you can just pop that in PuTTY. You can put the private key into PuTTY, and then essentially you can connect and you're off and going. Now, the third way is going to be Session Manager. Now, one thing to be aware of here, in one case, AWS calls it Session Manager. In another case, it calls it Systems Manager. Be aware that it's the same thing. It's probably a different business unit or different developer that created them, but Systems Manager and Session Manager are the same thing. They're just labeled differently for whatever reason. But you can see here that this is giving me a warning because it's not set up correctly. In fact, it's not set up at all because in this instance, I didn't set it up. So the service is not running. The permissions aren't there for Session Manager to actually work. So that's why I cannot connect to it. So let me show you how to actually set this up. I'm going to do this from scratch. There is a way that I could go back and fix this instance to have it running, but I think that's way above what they're going to ask on your exam. So I wouldn't worry about it. Just know that you can go back and get it running and fix it. It's not a big deal. But in order to get this working, we need to set up an IAM role. So what you need to do, I was already there because I was kind of planning ahead. But anyway, so come over to your dashboard. You'd say IAM, or you'd search for the IAM dashboard. You'd come in here and you need to go to roles because we're going to need to set up a brand new role that's going to have the ability, the permission to actually call the Session Manager service, install it, turn it on, and then we're off and going. So we're going to say create role. And what we're going to do is we're going to leave AWS service checked or highlighted. We're going to come over here to common use cases and we're going to select EC2. If things change a year from now, 6 months from now, and you don't see this view, you can scroll down just a little bit and you can select EC2. And when you select EC2, you're going to want this first one, select your use case. So we'll say EC2. Next, click on Set Permissions. This is where we're going to actually have to give this thing the policy. This is the security policy that we're going to allow this new role to have. Now, a lot of people come in and they say SSM full access. There's really nothing wrong with that. Technically it's not wrong. It's going to work and you're just going to give this role complete full SSM access, but you don't necessarily need that. What you need is going to be the managed instance core. So you're going to need this one here. Okay. So what this allows you to do, in fact, you can expand it and you can read what it allows you to do. So it allows that EC2 instance role to enable Systems Manager, enable that functionality on your behalf as if it's acting like you, so you're good to go. So that's all you need. You don't need full access, but again, if you want simplicity, you don't really care, you want to keep things simple that you always have that access, hey, go for full access. It doesn't bother me. So we'll say next to tags. We don't really care. We need to give this a name, so we're just going to say EC2_SSM, and we'll go ahead and say create role. Now, what this is going to do is this is going to give us a specialized role. So if I go into this role, you'll see that it does have permissions to essentially manage the SSM role. So we'll come back over to instances and we're going to launch a new instance. We'll pick the Amazon Linux 2. We don't really care about, we'll just say T2 Micro. Here we'll say my VPC. We don't care about the subnet. We'll go ahead and give this guy a public address. Why not? And what we're going to do is for the IAM role, you'll notice that there's two of them listed. So we're going to pick that ECS, that was supposed to be a 2, but anyway, we'll say that ECS or EC2 SSM role. Now here, I don't really care about anything else. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to say review and launch. This is going to take me right to the finish line. We'll go ahead and say, yes, I already have the key downloaded. We'll say launch. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause this video and essentially I'll come back once the instance is set up. It'll take about a minute or two, and then we'll go ahead and we'll use SSM is finished, and this is why we always go through the name tags. The only reason that I know it's the second one here is because I remember this address from the beginning. So let's go ahead and we'll click on this instance here, the second one in. We'll go ahead and say connect. And if I click on Sessions Manager, you'll notice that it does not say, hey, this is not set up, blah, 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 like the other one does. So now because of that IAM role, now I can use Sessions Manager or Systems Manager to be able to connect into my instance. So I'll go ahead and click connect. And just like you saw with Instance Connect, what this is going to do is this is going to drop me right into the CLI. So we'll be able to go ahead and let me click in there actually. So we'll say, we'll escalate our privilege and we'll say yum update Y. And again, nothing to update. That's fantastic. You'll also notice that there is a terminate button over here, so we can go ahead and say, yes, we want to terminate that session. So these are the 3 different ways essentially that you'll use to connect into your instance. Now there's another way that you can use Systems Manager. Let me just show you that really, really quick. So if you go back to your dashboard, you can select Systems Manager. This will bring you down to the Systems Manager dashboard. If you scroll down a little bit on the left-hand side, you should see System Manager or Session Manager. And this is what's going to allow you to essentially connect in. So you'll be able to say start a session. This is where it'll give you, this is the machine that we just set up. So once you say start a session, it'll give you any machine that's currently running Systems Manager. And as long as you've given it an instance name, you'll obviously be able to tell what it is. And then you would go ahead and say start session. That'll drop us into the same screen that we were just in. The thing again to remember is that without that IAM role, so let me head back over here, without that IAM role that gives you the managed instance core policy, or even full access, it's just not going to work. So make sure that when you go and you do this, if you're going to use Session Manager, System Manager, make sure that you go through first, go ahead and create that policy so that it's a little bit easier for you. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope this takes away some troubles connecting into your EC2 instances. I'll see you folks in the next video.